The meeting room felt colder than usual, as if the air itself had taken sides long before I walked in. The long polished table reflected the harsh ceiling lights, and every executive sat with a kind of practiced confidence I never fully mastered. They came in with their steaming coffees, designer pens, and rehearsed opinions, each one convinced the company existed because they were in it. I had watched this ritual countless times, but that morning something felt different. Maybe it was the heaviness in my stomach or the way the hall outside echoed as I walked toward the room, but something inside me warned that this meeting would not be like the others. I took my seat closer to the projector, organized my notes, and tried to steady my breathing. The financial risk report I was about to present represented 3 months of work. 3 months of late nights, digging through data others ignored, comparing trends no one else thought were worth their time, and building a model that predicted what might happen if the company stayed on its reckless path of optimistic spending. Numbers do not lie, even if the people who interpret them do. I believed that if I presented them clearly and calmly, the executives would finally understand the storm the company was heading into. I thought logic would win. I thought professionalism would matter. It was naive optimism, but at the time, I didn't know any better. Mark, the CFO, entered exactly on time as he always did. He liked making an entrance. Tall, confident, with that self-satisfied smile that usually came after he cut someone off in a meeting. His suit probably cost more than my monthly rent. He had a way of walking that suggested that even the floor was lucky to be stepped on by him. He greeted a few executives loudly, making sure they heard his voice even if they pretended not to. Then he sat at the head of the table, leaned back, and fixed his eyes on me with a look that already said he was not expecting much. When the CEO nodded at me, I stood up. My heart beat fast, but I knew my material. I had rehearsed this presentation so many times that the words felt engraved in my mind. I clicked the first slide. The charts glowed on the screen. I began explaining the early signs of budget inflation, the discrepancy between projected sales and real conversion rates, and the risks tied to the upcoming expansion Mark had pushed so aggressively. The room was silent at first, but not the attentive kind. It was the silent judgment that comes before a storm. Halfway through the presentation, when I pointed out the potential collapse of the quarter if the numbers continue their current trend, Mark leaned back farther in his chair. He folded his arms. The corners of his mouth lifted into a smirk. And then, in a tone dripping with condescension, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "You're overthinking again. We hired you to take notes, not lead strategy." For a moment, everything stopped. My breath froze in my throat. I looked around and saw the reactions unfold like a slow-motion humiliation. A few people looked down at their hands. Another executive coughed into his fist, the kind of cough people use when they hide a laugh they don't want to be caught making. One woman shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to say something but knowing better. And somewhere near the back of the room, someone chuckled softly. It was quick, almost invisible, but loud enough to feel like a slap. My face burned. My hands felt numb. For the first time in my career, I wanted to disappear. I wanted the floor to open and swallow me whole. But I didn't stop. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was that tiny part of me that still believed numbers mattered even when people did not. I cleared my throat and continued presenting. My voice trembled on the edges, but I finished every sentence, every slide, every point. I refused to let the humiliation silence me. Even if they mocked me, even if no one cared, I would not give them the satisfaction of watching me break. When the presentation ended, I closed my binder and took my seat again. No one applauded. Only the CEO nodded faintly, more out of courtesy than appreciation. Mark immediately moved on to the next topic, pretending my work had been a minor inconvenience in his morning schedule. They debated marketing expenses, new partnerships, and a potential merger, none of which made sense without the financial stability I had just tried to warn them about. It was as if my entire presentation had never happened. When the meeting adjourned, chairs scraped the floor and executives dispersed with the same casual arrogance they walked in with. I packed my binder slowly, trying not to show how deeply the moment had cut me. Everyone hurried past, eager to get back to their offices, their lunches, their comfortable routines. Mark approached last. He paused next to me. He gave me that same smirk, the one that seemed glued permanently to his face, and tapped my binder with 2 fingers. The gesture felt like being patted on the head like an obedient child. "Next time, keep it simple," he said. "This isn't a university lecture." He walked away without waiting for a response, and I stood there, trapped between humiliation and disbelief. How do you respond to someone who mocks your competence in front of an entire room and then pretends he has done you a favor? I swallowed everything I wanted to say. It was not fear. It was exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes from years of doing the work no one else wants to do, only to watch someone else take the credit, or worse, belittle it. I carried my binder to my desk, closed my laptop, and left the building earlier than usual. The drive home felt longer than normal. The city blurred past the windows, but I barely saw any of it. I replayed every second of the meeting in my mind. The laughter, the smirk, the way my voice cracked slightly, the heat in my cheeks when I realized people were. My heart beat faster as I opened one file after another. Some had duplicated entries that made no logical sense. Others skipped entire categories that were always present in previous years. It wasn't incompetence or oversight. It was control. Someone had spent time crafting an image of financial stability that wasn't real. A calculated illusion. And the person most invested in protecting that illusion was the same man who had mocked me openly just days before. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Anger can cloud judgment. But this wasn't anger anymore. It was evidence. So I dug deeper, going through archived spreadsheets from 5, 7, even 10 years back. I compared raw accounting logs to the polished monthly reports that had been shared with the board. Every comparison revealed inconsistencies, small enough to be dismissed individually but undeniable as a collective pattern. It became clear that Mark had been manipulating numbers long before I joined the company. He built his reputation on visionary leadership by shaping data to match whatever story he wanted to tell. The structure of the fraud was almost elegant in its subtlety. Fake cost reductions placed at times when new hires were made. Inflated sales forecasts conveniently aligned with product launches he had championed. Selective edits to expense categories right before board meetings. He understood that executives rarely question what flatters their expectations. Present people with numbers that promise growth, and they rarely look behind the curtain. Mark had mastered the art of showing only what people wanted to see. He silenced the truth by drowning it in applause. The realization unsettled me, not just because of the fraud, but because of what his behavior in the meeting suddenly meant. He had not dismissed me out of arrogance alone. He mocked me because I threatened him. My risk report was not an annoyance. It was dangerous. The numbers I presented edged too close to exposing the cracks he had been covering for years. His laughter had not been confidence. It had been fear disguised as superiority. Knowing that shifted everything inside me. As I continued analyzing documents, I discovered an old folder labeled Legacy Agreements. It was buried deeper in the archive, so old it required special access permissions to open. I requested access through the system, expecting IT to question me, but the approval came instantly. That alone struck me as odd. The folder had been untouched for years, yet my access was granted with no delay. I took it as a sign that whatever was inside had been forgotten, simply collecting digital dust. When the folder opened, I found decades-old scanned documents, many signed by board members who are no longer alive. Among them were partnership agreements, land purchases, the early bylaws of the company, and share certificates issued in the company's foundational years. These documents were relics of an era I had heard about only in passing. My father had been one of the earliest investors, but he rarely spoke about business at home. He preferred quiet evenings, chess games, and simple meals with family. To the outside world, he was known as a smart, disciplined investor. To me, he had simply been Dad. I scrolled through the files with mild nostalgia until one document stopped me. It was a dated agreement with the company's first president. At the bottom of the page was my father's signature, clear and unmistakable. I stared at it for a long moment, unsure whether I wanted to read further. When I finally did, the room felt suddenly smaller. The document stated that my father held 51% of the shares at the time of signing. Not unusual for an early investor, but what caught my breath was the clause beneath it. A clause I had forgotten existed. A clause specifying that every share in his name would transfer to me, his only child, the moment I turned 35. He had told me once, briefly, when I was much younger, that I would inherit his part of the company someday. I assumed he meant a small symbolic portion. Something sentimental. Something ceremonial. Never in my wildest imagination had I thought he meant majority control. My hands trembled as I scrolled to the end of the document. The clause was clear. It had never been modified. It had never been voided. It defined me as the automatic successor. There were no conditions, no votes required, no approval from the board necessary. My father had secured it in a time when handshakes meant something and signatures carried weight. I checked the date of the signing. The ink had faded in the scan, but the numbers were readable. I did not blink until I realized the page wasn't moving because I wasn't scrolling anymore. My own reflection in the screen looked stunned. The document was legally binding. It had been executed long before the company grew into the corporate giant it now was. That meant the shares expanded in value over the years, not just in number, but in authority. And the clause still held its power because no one had challenged it. No one had thought to. No one remembered it existed. I checked the transfer date. My birthday had been 2 months earlier. Quietly, on paper, without any ceremony or announcement, the shares had transferred to me the moment the clock struck midnight on my birthday. I had been walking through the office for 2 months as the majority shareholder, and not a single person knew. Not the CEO. Not the board. Not Mark. They had mocked the person who legally held more power than all of them combined. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the revelation anchoring me in place. My breath was shallow. My pulse echoed in my ears. I was the majority shareholder. The irony was almost painful. The woman they had tried to discredit in a meeting. The woman they considered a background figure. The woman who took notes, balanced budgets, and stayed late to fix issues others caused. I held the authority to restructure the entire company and remove anyone, including the CFO, who thought humiliation was a leadership style. In that moment, a clarity washed over me unlike anything I had ever felt. Not revenge, not pride, something steadier. A sense of alignment between who I had been raised to be and who I had become. My father had trusted me with something enormous. He believed in foresight, preparation, and integrity. He also understood the danger of people like Mark long before I met him. I saved the document in a private encrypted folder, backed it up twice, then stood and walked to the window. The city stretched below, restless and loud. Cars moved like veins across the streets, each one carrying someone to a life filled with small victories and quiet battles. And there I was, standing in an office building built on decisions made long before I existed, carrying a responsibility no one expected me to discover. I pressed my hands against the glass and whispered to myself without even realizing it, everything is about to change. Because it was. And deep down, I knew I wouldn't be the only one surprised by what came next. Silence can be a shield, but it can also be a weapon. After discovering the truth about the shares, I felt something in me shift. Not a burst of confidence, not an urge to celebrate, and certainly not a desire to confront anyone immediately. What I felt was clarity. Cold, quiet clarity. I understood that power meant nothing if used at the wrong moment. And timing, in corporate life, is everything. So I watched. I observed the office the way a doctor studies a patient before diagnosing an illness. Every hallway, every conversation, every meeting carried information I had been too buried in routine to notice before. Now I saw it all with the eyes of someone who had something to protect and something far greater to reveal when the moment came. Mark remained loud. He loved the sound of his own voice. In meetings, he exaggerated numbers, slapped charts on the table as if they were trophies he'd won, and paced around the room telling stories about vision and leadership. Most of those stories were borrowed from books he skimmed or seminars he half attended. But people listened because he delivered them with confidence. That was his gift, He had learned early in life that volume could replace competence if used consistently. The CEO, on the other hand, avoided accountability with the skill of a seasoned politician. He smiled often, agreed with everyone, and delegated responsibility the way children throw stones into a lake, carelessly, hoping the ripples reach someone else. Whenever a problem surfaced, he found a way to direct the blame downward. He called it empowering the team. Everyone else called it survival. HR was worse. Instead of upholding fairness, they protected the loudest and most powerful voices, fearing retaliation more than they valued integrity. Complaints vanished mysteriously. Reports were lost during system updates. Issues became communication misunderstandings. I knew HR would be useless if I confronted anything now. They were too entrenched in the hierarchy built around Mark and the CEO. The directors were no better. They nodded at anything Mark said, too afraid of losing their positions to challenge him. Some owed him favors. Others simply lacked courage. They followed him not because they believed in him, but because they were convinced no one else had the authority to challenge him. They had no idea how wrong they were. And through all this, I walked the halls unnoticed. People greeted me politely, some kindly, a few mechanically. None remembered what happened in that meeting. Or if they did, they pretended not to. In corporate environments, embarrassment quickly becomes someone else's memory. But for the person who experiences it, it stays carved in the heart. Still, they moved on. And that worked perfectly for me. Being invisible meant being strategic. I didn't alter my routine. I didn't change my tone. I didn't suddenly act differently. I blended into the daily rhythm, appearing focused, diligent, and indifferent to office politics. The less attention I attracted, the more freely I could observe. Each day offered a new detail, a new piece of behavior, a new example of the entitlement that ran unchecked through the office. During lunch breaks, I sat quietly with my small notebook, jotting down patterns. Not names, patterns. People reveal more than they intend when they talk freely. I listened to complaints about budget cuts that didn't make sense, conversations about expected bonuses tied to projections I knew were fabricated, and private frustrations about decisions made behind closed doors. I wasn't gossiping. I was learning how deeply Mark's manipulation had shaped the culture. At my desk, I began building what eventually became my greatest defense and my most dangerous weapon: documentation. I created private folders, encrypted files, and organized every discovery meticulously. It started with screenshots, emails where Mark approved inflated forecasts, chain conversations where the CEO instructed the marketing team to adjust numbers to show potential, and budget sheets edited minutes before meetings. Everything was subtle enough to be overlooked, but damning when put together. Then I moved on to gathering older files. I compared inconsistent documents year by year, finding trails of silent alterations. Some numbers had been smoothed out over time. Others had been shifted entirely. A few had simply been replaced. It wasn't sloppy work. In fact, it was clever. But when you look at enough altered documents in sequence, even clever manipulation becomes obvious. To avoid suspicion, I made sure my office lights stayed on late into the night. I pretended to catch up on work. Anyone passing by the glass windows of the office saw a dedicated employee finishing spreadsheets, not someone quietly preparing the future of the company. I positioned myself as the responsible, invisible worker. They never questioned why my screen never fully showed what I was working on. Some nights, when the cleaning staff arrived, I greeted them warmly and worked with my back turned toward the door. They probably thought I was overworked or trying to impress upper management. They had no idea I was building a storm designed to hit with precision. While I gathered digital evidence, I also studied people closely during the day. I noticed how two directors always left meetings whispering together, worried about losing influence. I saw how one manager intentionally misreported issues to protect his position. I observed how an analyst in finance hesitated every time Mark announced numbers publicly, as if she carried a secret she couldn't risk revealing. People's eyes reveal everything, especially when they are afraid. I learned how power truly flowed through the building, not through titles, not through skill, but through alliances built on convenience. Everyone in that hierarchy relied on the assumption that Mark controlled the narrative, the CEO controlled the decisions, and the board controlled the future. None of them expected the quietest employee to be the person holding the largest stake. I also analyzed my own behavior. I had always worked hard, always believed effort would be recognized. But now I understood something. Recognition rarely comes to the quiet, even when the quiet are the ones holding the structure together. But silence, when used deliberately, becomes a form of power. It becomes a mirror in which others expose themselves. One afternoon, while organizing old expense reports, I noticed something small but significant, an approval from 7 years ago missing the required countersignature. That wasn't unusual by itself, but when I compared it to other transactions from the same period, I realized a pattern. Approvals involving high-risk spending were often rubber-stamped by Mark alone, bypassing policy entirely. Tiny violations that accumulated into something much larger. The days leading to the vote were chaotic. Teams worked late putting together projections that didn't match reality. Legal revised contracts again and again. Mark held private meetings with the CEO, whispering enthusiastically about projected growth, while ignoring any data that contradicted his optimism. The building buzzed with anticipation, and no one questioned the pace. The merger felt inevitable, like a train accelerating down a track with no intention of slowing. The morning of the vote arrived with an unusual stillness. I dressed carefully, choosing a dark suit and tying my hair back with precision. Not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I understood that appearances influence perception, especially in moments when truth disrupts comfort. When I walked into the building, several employees greeted me warmly, unaware that the day would redefine the hierarchy entirely. The boardroom was arranged meticulously. Folders stacked neatly, pens aligned, seats positioned with importance. The atmosphere was thick with pride and tension, each executive radiating a sense of accomplishment as if the merger had already been approved. The CEO sat at the head of the table, face glowing with the anticipation of having his name attached to a legacy decision. Mark stood next to him, flipping through documents, making confident remarks, and brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. I sat at my usual place near the middle of the table, quiet and composed. No one paid attention to me, which was exactly what I wanted. The lawyer entered last. He was a thin man with silver hair and glasses that he constantly pushed up the bridge of his nose. He rarely spoke unless necessary and almost never looked in my direction in previous meetings. Today, though, his expression carried an unusual heaviness. The CEO opened the session energetically, praising the potential of the merger. He talked about future expansion, market dominance, and the strategic vision that would elevate the company. He spoke for nearly 10 minutes without taking a breath, basking in admiration from the directors. Mark followed with more confident statements, presenting glossy graphs that represented nothing more than inflated projections. He bragged about relationships he had built with the other company, connections he had nurtured, and opportunities he personally guaranteed. When the presentations ended, the CEO called for the signing of the preliminary documents. Assistants moved swiftly, placing each file in front of us. Pens were distributed, and signatures were gathered with ease. Page after page slid across the table like a silent current. Everything moved smoothly, almost too smoothly, as if the universe were waiting for the moment to shift. Then came the final contract. The merger agreement was thick, detailed, and legally binding in every possible sense. When the lawyer opened the folder, the room quieted. He adjusted his glasses, scanned the page, and hesitated. It was subtle, but I noticed. His finger traced a line, his eyes narrowing as he read it again. He took a breath, then cleared his throat. We cannot execute the merger without the approval of the majority shareholder. Silence fell with the weight of a falling stone. The air in the room changed. A stillness replaced the earlier confidence, a tightening that made even the chairs seem rigid. The executives looked around, expecting confirmation of something they thought they already knew. The CEO frowned. That's Mark. The lawyer didn't smile. He didn't soften his words. He shook his head slowly, firmly, and pointed to a clause in the contract.
No.
According to the signed transfer clause, it's her. Every face turned toward me. It was like watching a wave crash in slow motion. Confusion first, then disbelief, then fear. A silence pressed into the room so deeply it felt like the walls were listening. I met their eyes calmly, letting them feel the weight of what they had overlooked for years. Mark's reaction came last. His face drained of color, turning pale as if someone had pulled the ground out from under him. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He resembled a man who had finally seen the shadow of a storm he never believed would come. "There must be a misunderstanding," he stuttered, voice trembling. The lawyer didn't flinch. "No misunderstanding. The clause is clear. Her approval is required. Without it, the merger cannot move forward." He pushed the contract toward me. The pages slid across the table, stopping right in front of my hands. At the bottom of the final page was the signature line. Printed in bold letters, clean and unmistakable, was my name. Approval required. No exceptions. Mark stepped forward slightly, as if he could physically alter reality by closing the distance between us. His eyes darted between me and the lawyer, searching for a loophole. "We need to verify this," he insisted, his voice cracking. "We need to check the archives. Something isn't right." "It has already been verified," the lawyer replied calmly. "Multiple times. Your office requested the information late last night." Mark blinked at him in shock. "I didn't request anything." The lawyer looked at him with mild pity. "Your assistant did. I assume under your direction." Suddenly, everything in the room tilted. The executives realized what had happened. Someone had discovered the truth before Mark. Someone had forced him into this moment without his knowledge. And that someone had been me. The CEO tried to recover control. "Well, then we need to," but he didn't finish the sentence. He couldn't. The reality had already replaced every assumption they had walked in with. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, flipping the room upside down without a single raised voice. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I didn't say anything. My silence hit harder than a speech ever could. I picked up the pen slowly. Mark stepped back as if the motion alone threatened him. He looked at me with a blend of disbelief and desperation, his earlier arrogance evaporating into thin air. This was the first time he saw me, not as an employee, not as someone he could dismiss, but as someone who held actual authority. His eyes held a truth he could no longer ignore. "Wait," he said weakly. "We can talk about this." The desperation in his voice filled the room. Directors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The CEO's jaw tightened as if he had swallowed something bitter. But talking was no longer part of the equation. I placed the pen gently on the table without signing anything. The message was clear. The merger was not moving forward. Not with forged projections. Not with manipulated numbers. Not under Mark's leadership. For the first time since joining the company, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't dismissed. I wasn't overlooked. For the first time, they looked at me with fear, not because I raised my voice, but because I didn't need to. Power speaks loudest when it remains quiet. They scheduled the emergency board meeting for the very next morning. No introduction. No agenda. No explanation beyond the message marked urgent that appeared in my inbox overnight. I knew why they had called it. The merger collapsing so suddenly had created a tremor powerful enough to reach every floor of the company. People whispered in hallways. Assistants looked confused. Directors walked faster than usual, holding folders to their chests as if protecting themselves from questions they could not answer. When I entered the boardroom, every executive was already seated. The atmosphere felt heavier than the day before, thick with silent panic. The long table that once hosted cheerful lunches and self-congratulating discussions now resembled an arena for something none of them were prepared to face. The directors fidgeted with their pens. The CEO avoided my eyes. Mark sat near the head of the table, shoulders stiff, jaw clenched. He tried to smile when I approached my chair, but his lips trembled as if the muscles could no longer obey him. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," he said, forcing a tone that was supposed to sound professional. "I believe we can clear up yesterday's misunderstanding and cooperate professionally moving forward." I did not respond. I simply placed my folder on the table and waited. The silence was long enough to unsettle the directors. The CEO cleared his throat, attempting a reassuring tone, but even he sensed the ground beneath his feet had shifted. No one dared start the discussion. They all waited for me, though none of them wanted to admit it aloud. Finally, the board chairwoman spoke. We need clarity regarding the majority shareholder situation and the abrupt halt of the merger. Her voice, usually confident, wavered slightly. She turned to the lawyer, who sat near the far end of the table with a stack of documents. He nodded gently, confirming what he had revealed the day before. But before he could elaborate, I opened my folder. I did not rush. I did not dramatize the moment. I simply placed the first document on the table, a printed budget sheet. The number circled in red revealed a discrepancy so large it could not be dismissed as error. Several executives leaned forward instinctively, trying to understand what they were looking at. This, I said calmly, is the altered budget for the fourth quarter of last year. I placed another page beside it. This is the original. Gasps spread across the room. The difference between the two was startling. One predicted growth. The other warned of decline. Both carried digital signatures, one legitimate, the other forged. I continued, without commentary. I wasn't there to convince them emotionally. I had brought proof, and proof speaks its own language. The next set of papers revealed inflated revenue forecasts. Each chart carried data that contradicted actual sales. Each projection justified bonuses, raises, and flashy announcements at board meetings that had praised the company's direction. Every false number reflected a deliberate manipulation designed to maintain Mark's image as a visionary leader. Someone whispered, "My God." Another director sank back into his seat, as if the revelation physically weakened him. I turned another page. And another. And another. Forged approvals. Messages showing deliberate bypassing of protocol. Budget lines that had been moved, hidden, or altered entirely. I laid everything out slowly, methodically, creating a trail no one could ignore. The room became so quiet that even the hum of the air conditioning felt intrusive. I could hear breathing, the faint tick of a watch, and the subtle rustle of paper whenever someone shifted. Mark tried to speak. "This is being taken out of context," he insisted, voice unsteady. "These are normal adjustments. Every company—" I lifted my hand gently. He stopped mid-sentence, as if the gesture had frozen him. "There's more," I said. I placed a printed email thread on top of the pile. Messages between the CEO and Mark, discussing polishing the numbers before the last investor meeting. The CEO's face drained of color. He gripped the armrest of his chair, as if holding on to the last bit of control. When a director reached for the document, the CEO attempted to intervene. "I can explain," he began. I placed another email on the table. One where the CEO explicitly approved releasing a forecast he knew had been manipulated. The directors reacted instantly. Their trust in him dissipated like smoke. He tried to defend himself, but the words collapsed before forming. Authority built on illusion cannot withstand truth presented without emotion. I turned the final page in my folder. "This," I said evenly, "is the bonus request Mark submitted for himself, supported by numbers that did not exist." The room erupted, not loudly, but internally. You could see the shock move through every person like a cold wave. They stared at the document as if it held the answer to a question none of them had asked. How long had he been lying to them? How many decisions had been made on false information? How much had the company lost because of his deception? Mark tried again. "Wait, please listen," but I did not let him. He had spoken enough in his lifetime. He had mocked enough people, silenced enough criticism, hidden enough truth. It was time for silence to return the favor. "We trusted you," one director said, voice shaking with anger. "I trusted both of you," another added, glancing from Mark to the CEO. "This is fraud," a third whispered. The CEO opened his mouth, but I placed the final piece of evidence onto the table. A timeline of approvals showing how both men had knowingly bypassed internal checks. Then I sat back and let the room absorb the truth. The chairwoman spoke first. "This is a catastrophic breach of ethical and legal standards." Another director followed. This could have cost us the company. Someone else added, "This explains why the numbers never matched." I always suspected something, but I didn't know where to look. Each voice added another layer of condemnation. Each admission tightened the tension in the room. Mark looked smaller by the second. His shoulders sagged as he realized no spin, no charm, no volume could save him. The CEO stared at the documents quietly, as if waiting for the pages to rearrange themselves into something less incriminating. That was when I spoke the sentence that changed everything. As majority shareholder, I call for a vote to remove Mark from his position effective immediately. The words cut through the room with surgical precision. There was no shouting, no hesitation. Just the undeniable weight of authority finally spoken aloud. A silence followed, but it was the silence of inevitability. The chairwoman nodded solemnly. All in favor? Hands rose. One by one. Predictable. Reluctant. Resigned. Determined. Every hand except Mark's. His hand trembled but remained on the table, fingers curled, nails pressing into the wood. It wouldn't have mattered. The vote did not need his approval. The power he believed he controlled had never belonged to him. It had been an illusion, and illusions collapse quickly when reality is displayed page by page, undeniable and complete. As the vote concluded, the boardroom shifted in a way I cannot fully describe. Not with noise, there was none. Not with celebration. This wasn't a victory to anyone but the truth. What filled the room was recognition. Recognition that they had underestimated the wrong person. Recognition that silence is not weakness. Recognition that power does not always arrive with noise. When the decision was final, the chairwoman closed her folder and spoke. Security will escort him out. Mark stared at me, not with anger, not with hatred. Those emotions require confidence. He looked at me with a broken understanding. The truth he had tried to bury had become the force that buried him instead. I gathered my documents calmly. No one laughed. No one smirked. No one dismissed me. Silence had finally spoken. And it spoke loudly enough for the entire company to hear. The image of the company changed overnight. What had once been portrayed as a model of stability now looked vulnerable. Department heads reviewed their strategies. Managers re-examined processes. Teams held emergency check-ins. Everyone responded to the shift in their own way. Some with fear, some with hope, others with determination. But no one remained unchanged. The truth had broken through the surface like a crack running across glass, visible, unstoppable, and shaping everything around it. Yet amid the turbulence, something unexpected happened. The noise of arrogance disappeared. It was as if someone had lowered the volume on a soundtrack that had been playing constantly in the background. The arrogant laughter that once echoed in hallways evaporated. The self-congratulatory speeches in meetings vanished. The dismissive comments that overshadowed real work fell silent. For the first time in years, people felt the absence of something they had not realized was suffocating them. Without Mark, the office felt cleaner. Not physically, though the maintenance team was working overtime, but energetically. The tension he carried everywhere, the force of his ego pressing against everyone else, was gone. He had taken with him the toxic confidence that dominated every room he entered. In its place was something quieter, calmer, and surprisingly refreshing. Employees who once avoided speaking up began contributing in meetings. Analysts who had been overshadowed by loud voices finally presented their real findings. Even supervisors who had spent years catering to Mark's unrealistic expectations relaxed enough to breathe normally. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Toxicity doesn't leave footprints, but its absence creates space. Space for people to think. Space for ideas to grow. Space for truth to exist without being crushed by narrative. I observed all of this from a distance, not as a spectator, but as someone who understood the importance of letting the company recalibrate itself. I didn't rush to take control. I didn't make announcements. I didn't stand on a pedestal to explain my actions. I let the structure settle. Change requires stillness before motion. And silence, the kind I had used for months, remained my greatest ally. One afternoon, as I prepared to leave the office, a junior employee approached me hesitantly. She introduced herself softly and thanked me. She didn't say for what specifically, and she didn't need to. Gratitude often expresses itself best in simple words. I nodded and wished her a good evening. She smiled, something small but sincere. Moments like that made me realize that removing one man had freed many more. Later that week, the audit's preliminary report was completed. The board convened again, this time with a different tone. There was no defensiveness, no illusions of control, only a sobering acceptance of reality and a determination to rebuild. They reviewed the findings carefully, acknowledging the failures, the blind spots, and the consequences. When they spoke to me, it was not with fear, but with respect. True respect, earned not through noise or force, but through precision, integrity, and patience. The fall of the Golden Boy was not a spectacle. It was not revenge in the dramatic sense. It was the inevitable outcome of truth meeting illusion. A man who built his legacy on manipulation had finally been measured against honesty, and the result was unavoidable. And as I walked through the corridor that evening, feeling the air lighter around me, I realized something powerful. Sometimes the greatest transformation in an organization is not the rise of a new leader, but the removal of the one who never deserved the role. Mark's departure created a silence that lingered in the hallways long after security escorted him out. It wasn't the silence of fear or uncertainty. It was the silence that comes after a long storm finally breaks and the sky settles into a calm it hasn't seen in years. With him gone, the weight of his influence dissolved almost instantly. The manipulation, the intimidation, the noise, everything evaporated. But the void left behind wasn't empty. It was an opportunity, a new beginning. And for the first time since joining the company, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: clarity without interruption. When I stepped into the boardroom 2 days after the audit report was finalized, every director looked at me with a different expression than they had months earlier. Respect, expectation, relief. No one pretended anymore. No one underestimated what I had uncovered or what it meant for the future. The chairwoman addressed me as the point of stability the company desperately needed. She asked if I was prepared to guide the transition. I didn't give a long speech. I simply nodded once. That was enough. Taking control wasn't about authority. It was about responsibility. And I understood the difference well. My first task was restructuring the departments that had suffered the most under Mark's leadership. I didn't start with the executives. I started with the teams he had silenced, the analysts whose reports he altered, the managers he overworked and undervalued, the coordinators who carried the weight of impossible expectations. I met with them individually, listened to their concerns, reviewed their workloads, and studied the systems that had been manipulated for years. They spoke cautiously at first, unsure if honesty was finally safe. But once they realized I wanted the truth, not theatrics, they opened up. And what they revealed was more valuable than any audit. Patterns emerged quickly. Patterns of pressure. Patterns of avoidance. Patterns of fear. People had been walking on eggshells for so long that they had forgotten what stability felt like. I reorganized teams based on competence, not favoritism. Titles shifted. Responsibilities rebalanced. Communication channels reopened. The messy structure built around protecting Mark's image collapsed, replaced by one designed for actual productivity. For the first time in years, people felt heard. Not because I promised change, but because I acted on what they told me. Promotions came next. Not dramatic announcements or flashy titles. Quiet recognitions of consistent effort. The people who had worked in silence, producing high-quality work without applause, finally received the acknowledgement they deserved. Some cried in my office. Others simply nodded, visibly relieved that their contributions had finally been seen. It reminded me of something my father once said: "Reward the ones who don't demand attention. They are the ones holding everything together." Removing toxicity required precision. Not anger. Not retaliation. Precision. A few managers who had aligned themselves with Mark's behavior resisted the changes. They questioned new procedures, blamed their teams for old failures, or attempted to reassert their authority through subtle intimidation. I reviewed their performance objectively. Patterns don't lie. Some were reassigned to roles better suited to their actual skills. A few were dismissed quietly, with documented reasons, and HR protocols followed meticulously. I didn't enjoy it, but their presence prevented progress. You cannot rebuild a structure on damaged beams. Updating policies was the next phase. For years, the system had been shaped around protecting egos and avoiding accountability. Approvals required signatures that meant nothing. Reports were reviewed too late to matter. Evaluations measured compliance rather than competence. I gathered the outdated documents, highlighted inconsistencies, and rewrote entire sections with the help of a small committee of employees I trusted. The new version emphasized transparency, responsibility, and fairness. The board approved the changes unanimously. By the end of the first month, something shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but noticeably. People walked through the office with less tension in their shoulders. They spoke openly, without checking who might be listening. Meetings became shorter and more efficient. Reports became accurate rather than inflated. Even the atmosphere felt lighter. The air that once carried arrogance now carried purpose. 3 months later, the results emerged in numbers as unmistakable as the evidence that had exposed Mark. Profits stabilized. Not because of some sudden miracle or aggressive strategy, but because people finally had the space to do their jobs without obstruction. When employees feel safe, they do better work. When systems are truthful, problems can be solved. When leadership listens instead of performing, progress becomes predictable. No one celebrated prematurely. The wounds of the past were still healing. But there was progress, and progress carries hope. By the 6th month, the company stood healthier than it had in years. Investors began returning with cautious optimism. Partnerships previously paused resumed discussions. The media shifted its tone, praising the company's transparency and responsible restructuring. Departments reached milestones without crisis meetings or last-minute corrections. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And honest growth is sustainable growth. In my 20s, I would have reacted emotionally to what Mark did. I would have confronted him, argued with him, cried in private, replayed every insult in my head, and written long emails that tried to prove my worth. I would have tried to fight noise with noise. That is what youth teaches us, that volume equals strength. But with age, you learn the truth. Strength is the ability to remain still when others are yelling. Strength is strategy, not anger. Strength is knowing that storms pass. Strength is letting silence do the work when words become useless. The real lesson, the one I carry with me even now, is that power lives on paper long before it ever lives in a room. Power is not noise. Power is paperwork. It's in the signatures, the clauses, the outdated bylaws no one bothers to read, and the legal structures everyone takes for granted. It's in the details that arrogant people dismiss because they assume everyone else is too busy, too ignorant, or too intimidated to look closely. Power isn't the person who speaks the loudest. It's the person who understands the rules better than the people who mock them. Mark thought he controlled everything because he controlled perception. He controlled the meetings, the numbers, the narratives. He controlled the tone of the office, the culture of fear, and the illusion of competence. But he never controlled the foundation. He never controlled the real authority that lived in archived documents established years before he arrived. He never imagined that someone quiet, someone he saw as irrelevant, someone he believed was beneath him, would be the person holding the key to everything he wanted. That was his mistake. People like him always underestimate the quiet ones. And that is where the second lesson comes in. Power is proof, not opinions. Not emotions. Proof. When I laid down the documents, the altered budgets, the fake forecasts, the forged approvals, everything became undeniable. Truth might move slowly, but it moves with a certainty that cannot be stopped. Proof is patient. Proof is consistent. Proof is not afraid of scrutiny. And most important of all, proof does not argue. It simply exists. It sits quietly on the table while others panic. For anyone over 35, here is what I learned. You don't win by shouting. You win by documenting. You win by staying prepared. You win by letting people expose themselves while you collect the evidence. Real revenge, if you even call it that, is not about destruction. You don't destroy them. You replace them. Replace their influence with competence. Replace their entitlement with structure. Replace their arrogance with integrity. Quietly. Professionally. Without ever raising your voice. That is the part that younger versions of ourselves struggle to understand. We are taught that making a point requires volume. That respect comes from confrontation. That justice requires drama. But experience teaches you otherwise. Once you reach a certain age, you realize that dignity is more effective than aggression. Poise is more strategic than pride. And silence, when used correctly, becomes the sharpest instrument of all. I walked into that boardroom as someone they dismissed. I walked out as someone they feared, not because I threatened them, but because I didn't need to. The difference between fear and respect is small, but meaningful. Fear fades. Respect roots itself. And respect built on truth outlasts everything. There is a moment everyone over 35 eventually reaches. A moment when you see yourself not through the eyes of those who belittled you, but through the lens of your own resilience. The day you stop explaining yourself. The day you stop justifying your existence. The day you realize that people who try to diminish you are simply trying to stop you from seeing what they already know, that you are capable of surpassing them.